Hi, this is Lynn Wizicki from the Illuminating Lens doing a quick video on how to create and post-process a panorama. First question is, why a panorama? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First off, you've got this wide vista, kind of like this image at the top here, and there's no way a wide angle lens is going to get all of that unless it's really, really tiny. So that's one reason. Sometimes you want to go and do a vertical. If you got something like a tall building or tall trees, you can actually do a vertical or vertorama instead of a panorama. And if there's just so much in front of you that you just cannot collect it all in one shot, then that's when you can do, 3 image panorama. You can do a 25 image panorama. We're going to talk about the more simple ones this time. There are actually panoramas where you can do multiple layers, where you shoot one layer on top and then you shoot the second layer. And some people do, 100 shots. It's a very complicated panorama. We're not going to get into that today. The other reason why you might want to do a panorama is you want more pixels. So if you have to do an image for, say, a billboard or something that wants, like a mural type image on the wall, you want as many pixels as you can get to be able to blow up the image that big. And putting a panorama together creates a lot of pixels right off the bat. So that's one thing. And then the other issue is sometimes our wide angle lenses have lens distortion. And so that could make the very edges and sometimes the top, but particularly the edges of a wide angle lens look kind of strange, and using a panorama or creating a panorama will eliminate a lot of that. So there's a lot of reasons why you would want to do a panorama. So how do we do a panorama? Well, the easiest one is that camera that you carry around with you all the time is your phone. All the phones, the modern phones now have, their current phones have a panorama setting in their native cameras. So go in there, click on the panorama, and most of them you shoot in the vertical, and there's a line that goes across with an arrow in it, and you keep as you go across your scene, keep the arrow on the line, and you will get to the end of the side of the arrow and the line, and you get to the end of the line, and it'll stop, and you will have a panorama almost instantly. Problem with those is they're not that big of an image. They still can be pretty good, and then you've got to actually be very steady. You can do this by hand, but you have to be steady as you follow that line. And it does tell you you're going too fast or going too slow, or stay on the line. So let me show you a few images that I took with my phone. This was in Death Valley, and this was actually taken with my phone, and this was pretty wide. I kind of almost went more than 180. I probably went past. I was standing at the very edge of that crevasse and went from all the way past my shoulder all the way around to the other side. So this is actually probably wider than most panoramas. And then here's another one. We finally had a great sunset in Death Valley, and I had on the long lens on my camera, so I just grabbed my phone and took an image using my phone. So that is one way to do a panorama. Here's another image that I actually shot with my phone as well as a panorama. So keep that in mind when you're out there shooting. That, if you see something that's interesting and you want to get that wide view, use your phone. But there's another way to do that as well. If you've only taken one image, a lot of times I'll take a wide angle image and I'll decide that it needs to be more of a panoramic view because I need to get rid of the stuff at the top and the stuff at the bottom. And so I will actually and I've actually done that with telephoto lenses too. For example, like this shot of these black skimmers, which I purposely overexposed, and there was just too much stuff above and below them, and so I cropped it to create a panorama. So a panorama doesn't even really have to be a big wide vista, it can be just wide anything. Here's another example of a cropped image that I took of all these white pelicans out at Fort DeSoto. Wanted to just, kind of zero in on them and eliminate everything else. I do probably should have cropped it a little tighter at the top because I'm seeing stuff there that I don't want to see. But again, crop to make a panorama as well. Now here's a wide angle image that I shot with a pretty wide, it was at 58 millimeters, and I went ahead and what was this one? And I cropped it in order to get it to be, the size I wanted, the bridge to be prominent in this. So it was cropped as well. And this one again is another wide angle. I shot with my 14-24 lens, and it is pretty wide, and you can see that there is a little distortion on the ends. But and some lenses are better than others at distortion. I probably did some correction on this as well, just to keep the building straight. But again, it was a wide angle lens that I cropped to make into a single panoramic image. Again, here's another one. This one was taken back in, I think, 2016. Stopped the car, jumped out, and took this image, and it is actually on my wall. It was in that very first picture that I showed you. And again, this one was cropped. The sky wasn't all that great. Probably you could use a little less sky even now. And I think I probably had a little bit of something else in the front here, but I did crop that to give that panoramic view. The next image is actually inside. This was taken inside the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So you don't always have to take an image, panorama outdoors in a vista. This is a unique building. It's built in the shape of a wagon wheel, and I was standing in the hub, and it was just kind of cool to see all these spokes of the building going out with all the like arches coming into the hub and then going out over the spokes of the building. And this is actually only half of the view from the hub, and so I stood there and took this one basically with this was taken with my camera, and this is actually a true panorama that was created in camera, or not in camera, but I created the images in camera and then I put them together in post-processing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Here's another one. This is one of my favorites. Again, this was image that was in our very first image for the slide or for the show, and this one was recreated in metal and printed in metal and is on my wall. So this one again was a very wide vista. I was just crazy happy about getting lenticular clouds over the mountains here in Death Valley, and this was again back in 2016. And I wanted to get down low, and I basically I wanted to get everything in there. The salt flats, which is, I think this is the Devil's Golf Course, which is this very rough, salty, actually sharp protrusions coming out of the ground from the salt drying out. And so I just wasn't getting what I wanted with a wide angle lens, so I decided to do a panorama. And so this one was, I think, 13 or 19. We'll do that one in a minute. Images that I combined in post-processing. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to and put in a quick video that I did to show you the technique. Okay, there's some people that say that doing a panorama you need a tripod and a panning head, and that's not really the case anymore. The post-processing programs in Lightroom and Photoshop are so good now that you can pretty much handhold as long as you're pretty steady and be able to do a panorama pretty easily. I have a quick video showing my technique. I stand with my legs slightly apart for sturdiness, and then I check to make sure that my camera is in manual mode so that no exposures change as I'm walking through my image. Then I take a picture of my hand to show the starting of the series. I put the camera in vertical and start way past, bend my waist and don't move my feet, and start taking images with a 20 to 25% overlap for each image. You may take a lot of images, you may only take a few depending on how wide you're shooting with your camera. Take as many as you need, and then take one more than you need, and then take a picture of your hand to end the image. One thing I did mention in the video was that you need to try not to basically change anything while you're moving the camera. Sometimes you might need to do a little refocusing, so you might take your time. I kind of went pretty quickly there in the video, but you can actually take your time as long as you don't lose track of where you are in your image, and make sure you have that overlap that you need in order for the post-processing programs to figure out how to stitch all this together. So the next part of this is post-processing, and there's two main ways to do post-processing of panoramas now. There's a lot of other apps out there that can do this, but if you have Lightroom, as far as I'm concerned, that's the easiest way to do it. It can handle most situations, unless there's multiple layers of rows of, if you're doing like top row, middle row, second, third row of images and trying to sew all those together. Photoshop does a better job of that. But the cool thing about Lightroom is they've got a lot of things built right into their Panorama processor that takes care of a lot of stuff that you would have to go back and do in Photoshop, and do a lot of other stretching and correcting things, where Lightroom kind of handles it all for you all at once. So if you don't have a really complicated panorama and you're using Lightroom, I'd highly recommend using Lightroom. So here I've got a series of images. This was the images I took in Death Valley back in 2016, and you'll see I took a picture of my hand to show that this was the beginning of the series. Then I took, actually on this one I took 10 images, all in vertical. You want as much information as you can, and vertical is the way to do it. It's a little harder to do these in horizontal. The only exception would be if you were doing a Vertorama. If you were going up and down, or up or down, you would want to take them in horizontal. But since we're going from side to side, we want to take them in a vertical orientation. So you can see here all the different images, and then at the end of the series I took a picture of my hand again in order to show me in all my thousands of pictures that I had from this shoot which ones were the ones for a panorama. Try to remember to do this every time. I don't always remember it, but I try when I decide I'm going to do a panorama. I try to shoot my hand at the beginning and the end just so I know where they are in all the stuff that I have. So anyway, in Lightroom, you would take this whole series. Oh, and one thing I wanted to mention is some people will try to process their images prior to doing the panorama, and you can do that. The only problem with that is you might end up with some strange, if you're not doing everything exactly the same, you could do a sync, process one and sync all the rest of them. That's what a lot of people that process their images prior to creating the panorama do. But I have a tendency to go ahead and create the panorama with what I've got, and then because Lightroom has gotten pretty good at processing stuff now, I just go ahead and process it after I've created the panorama. So in this one, we're going to go ahead and we're going to click and select all of these 10 images. Then I'm going to go up here to Lightroom where it says, actually photo, and you normally would go edit in, but this time we're going to go to photo merge, which is specifically made for Lightroom. And you can see here that we have a couple of choices in the drop-down menu. We have HDR, we have panorama, and we have HDR panorama. So in this case, we're just going to do a panorama. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to start doing its processing thing. And it's actually, unless you have a lot of images, and obviously these are raw images, so they're fairly big. This camera, they're around 46 megapixels. It's going to take a couple of seconds to do this. My computer is actually pretty fast. That's one other thing you need to be mindful of. When you're trying to do panoramas, the more images you get and use, and the bigger they are in terms of megapixels, you're going to need a lot of juice in your machine to keep, get to put all this together and in a timely manner. Now, a slower machine will just take a little longer, but the program should be able to handle this, unless you've got a whole lot of other stuff open on your computer. Now, this is what you get to start off with. You have some choices here: spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. And spherical seems to work for most things. Occasionally, I'll try one of these others. Perspective works when you're trying to combine a couple of images that are on top of each other. So if you're doing probably a Panorama, perspective might work better. The other cool things about this is this got this boundary warp, which kind of straightens things out, which you don't have that in Photoshop that I could find. So that is a really cool thing to have here as well. I mean, it's not terribly obvious in this one, but it does make a difference. You can also ask it to fill in the edges, which is kind of like a content-aware fill. This one doesn't really need it because it's pretty. I shot this one pretty wide, and you can have it do an auto crop, which it's doing that now. Let's see if I take it off, if it makes a difference. No, you can have it do an auto crop. The auto settings I usually leave off, and because I don't want it to make any changes to it, and then it will create a stack if you click this. So instead of having all those images spread out in your Lightroom catalog, they'll all be sitting underneath the final DNG images, which this will be creating. So let's go ahead and create this one. We're going to do merge, and it's going to take a few seconds to do that as well. Okay, I went ahead and stopped the recording for a minute so that it would we wouldn't be sitting here waiting for this thing to process. It only took a few seconds, so it's not too bad. But here is the image that it created from the merge that it did in Lightroom. And so I would actually go in here and do a little more work on this. I would obviously crop out my shadow. And you could probably do a little straightening with this as well. It's not, that's not working too well. But it's a lot, in actuality, the road there is not straight. It is going up a hill and then going down a hill. So this is actually probably closer to reality than it appears to be. So this is basically the way you would create a panorama in Lightroom. And you can obviously do all the changes, and I'm not going to sit here. This is not about post-processing and creating whatever, but you can go in here and make all the changes that you want to make to bring out the contrast and do whatever you want to do with this image. But that's basically how you would do this with a regular, this was a 10 image panorama. Now let's go and try a different one. This one is basically this picture here is where that's the end game of this picture. But this one I took in Death Valley this past January. And again, I took a picture of my hand. It was cold this time. It was very cold. We were there in January. The other time I was in there in, it was April. It was a little less cold. And in fact, I think that it was 100 and some degrees when we were there in April. And in January, it was like in the 30s and 40s. But anyway, I have my gloves on. And so I took one. This one is a little different. This one is an HDR panorama. So you'll notice that I bracketed three images per shot, basically, or per spot. And so this one is quite a bit bigger than, in terms of the number of images we're talking about, than the previous one. So there's the reason why I did an HDR, as you can see, there was some pretty dark areas, which were the hills and the parts in front of me, and then the sky was very bright because it was fairly early in the morning. It was 7:30 in the morning, and so sun had already come up, and so we were kind of big contrast. So when you use HDR, when you have a lot of contrast, and I shoot bracketed a lot. I don't always use them for HDR. I at least have them available if I need them. But in this case, I wanted to use this because I had such a big dynamic range going on between the mountains and the ground in front of me and the sky. So in this case, I would select all of these. And there's also some controversy about how to do this as well. Some people will go ahead and process the HDR, the 3 HDR images individually to start off with. And if you have a lot of images, in this case we've got 24, it's not too bad. Then you would go ahead and take each 3 set or whatever bracketed number you have. You could have 5, you could have 7, and process those separately and then put them together. My problem with that though is, again, getting everything exactly the same each time, and it's not always possible, especially when you're moving across a large landscape also in time, because even while you're just doing those few seconds of shots, the light could change dramatically. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and we're going to process the HDR at the same time that we process the panorama. So basically, we're going to go up here again to photo, go to photo merge, and this drop down menu again says HDR panorama. So we're going to go over here and we're going to hit that. And it's going to take a bit longer to process because of the fact that it's actually doing the HDRs as well as the panoramic sewing of the images together. So I'm going to stop this for a second, the recording for a second, and then I'll come back on once it's done. Okay, it only took about a minute, and here is our image. It's a combination of HDR and panorama. Again, it's as with any other HDR, you've got to do some processing. What you've got here is a lot of information. If you took the same image in a single image and you had it in Lightroom, you would not have as much dynamic range to work with. But because this is 3 images, basically put together and then stitched together, then you can go into Lightroom and do the post processing on it. This one's actually fairly straight. Not sure why. I'm doing just a little bit of boundary warp here just to see if it makes a difference, and it does a little bit, so we'll put that on there. Again, I didn't need to because I shot fairly straight across. I didn't have to fill in any edges. If you kind of took it a little more in a more of a curve, you would probably you would have some parts that didn't have anything in them, so you would click in the fill edges and it would fill in those edges for you. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to merge this, and again, this is going to take a few minutes, so I'm going to stop the process or the recording, and I'll start it back up once it's done. Okay, we now have another panorama. Let's see, where did I put it? There it is, right there. And it looks pretty much like it did in the pre-merging thing, and it does take it took about 2 minutes to process it, and obviously it's a fairly large image. We'll take a look at it. It's 15,473 pixels on the long side, so it's a big image, and the size of it is, I don't see it right here right now. So anyway, there it is. Once it has been processed by Lightroom. Then again, you would go in here and start fixing some of this stuff. And like I said, you've got a lot more leeway in terms of dynamic range when you're using an HDR picture. So always keep that in mind. And see, there's a lot of spots in here that I need to clean out. That's another thing when you're shooting multiple images like this and you combine them all, you see all the spots on your sensor. So I'll have to spend some time cleaning those off. I can't remember if I'm sure I did it with the final image in before. But in this one, I did a lot of work on this one besides cleaning off the sensor spots, and it did some painting and some light using the brush here, and this area I know is colorful. So I actually brought in some light on some of these spots here and kind of changed what it looked like just a little bit because it's so dark. And this is in the shadow of the mountains that are behind me because the sun is still relatively low. And you just add a little light in some of these areas and it just kind of makes everything pop. And this is kind of a crude, quick work out with this image, but you could see what you could create something pretty cool looking, pretty quickly by taking creating a panorama out of a wide vista like this. So so the final image that I end up with previously is this one here. So yeah, I did a little work on this one. And it's still a little bright, the sky, but it's still, this is basically the last image I took before we left Artist Drive the last morning of my trip into Death Valley. So this is kind of a cool picture just because there was last image, one of the last images I took while I was there. Now, what about Photoshop? We're going to go in and we're going to go and redo this group here that we did before with Lightroom, and we're going to do it with Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and actually we'll keep that one, but let's move it over here so that's not in the way. All right, so we're going to go ahead and create a panorama in Photoshop now. And so let me pull in all these images. I'm going to select them all, then I'm going to go back up to Photo and I'm going to edit in. And this time I'm going to go to this big menu over here and go all the way down to the bottom, and it says Merge to Panorama. Now you may not have as long a menu as I've got a lot of programs that are plugins, so that's why mine is so long. But if you just go down to the bottom of this drop down menu, you'll find Merge to Panorama in Photoshop. And that is going to take us into Photoshop, which I already have open, so hopefully it won't take too long. Okay, here we go. Here's the dialog box that comes up from Photoshop. And it's got all the files listed here that I just picked, and it's got all these layouts. And generally with most panoramas, just letting it do auto, which is the default, is just fine. Now the other thing is you've got to make some choices down here, and this is where some of the things that Lightroom does are available down here as well. And let's just go ahead and check all of these. A lot of times people say, yeah, no, I want to do it myself, but sometimes it's a lot easier just to let Photoshop do its thing, and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to say okay. And now Photoshop is opened up. Let's get rid of, we don't need Nick right now. I don't know if I can. Okay. And as you see, it's pulling in all those images as layers. Over here on the right hand side, all the layers are being added. And it does take a minute or two for Photoshop to do all this, but it's usually pretty quick. Again, if you've got a computer that's not 10 years old, sorry. Got to have a pretty fast processor to do this kind of stuff, especially if you got a lot more images than this. We only had 10 in this particular instance. Okay, now it's actually aligning, so it does a lot of this stuff automatically, kind of like Lightroom did. They're just showing you what it's doing. So it's aligning the selected layers, and then it will combine them and create a big huge file. This is now it's actually aligning the layers, and it will take, again, it's going to take a few minutes to do all this, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording for now. It's now in process of putting all the layers together, and if you look over at the layers over to the right over here, you'll see that it's actually taking portions of each image, or taking the images and kind of sticking them together. Once it's done, it'll actually show you what part of each image it's using in that combination of the layers. Photoshop is actually pretty smart. Basically it's showing you what what Lightroom does without showing you what's going on. So it's taking probably a total of 5 minutes to do all this. So just as FYI, it is a time-consuming process. If you're in a hurry, don't try to do a big panorama because it'll take your computer a while to do this. And try not to do anything else. It's probably slowed down a little bit because I'm also running the video program at the same time, so that slows things down as well. But as you can see, it's created masks over here, and you can see which part of the picture that it's each one of these images which one it's used for the image. And it, like I said, these programs are really good at sticking things together now. 5 to 10 years ago, this was not that easy. It was always a kind of a pain to see what they ended up with. And you could see seams in the picture, and it was just not a pretty sight. And so doing a panorama a few years ago was not as easy as it is now. So as you can see here, there's all these layers, and each of the white pieces, in the mask, are showing what it's actually using in the image. So, and then again, I'm going to get rid of this nick thing here, and you can see that again it's pretty crooked, very keystone because I went pretty wide with this thing, and in this case it did fill in. You could see where the crawling ants are. And those are areas outside of there where actually it did a content-aware fill. And so this image is probably a little bigger than the one that Lightroom created. So, and it is 2.22 gigs. So it is a monster image. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and flatten the image and get rid of all these layers, because that just makes it a lot bigger file. So let's go ahead and flatten it. Takes a little bit to do that because there's a lot of, oh, this was pretty quick. Okay, so now we have our finished image here in terms of the HDR, and like I said, we could go in and we'd have to create another layer, and then we could use freeform or transform, one of these. I don't know which one will work very well. This is, I have to admit, I'm not terribly great at straightening things out in Photoshop, especially something like this that doesn't really have a really good straight line in it. So we could try warp and just see what it does here. Yes, we could pull it down a little bit. Yeah, this will work. Warp it out a little bit, just straighten it out a little bit. You do lose a little bit of the picture, but it is a panorama, so you've got a lot of stuff here. And you can pull it from the bottom, from the sides as well. So you can go up and down, and that's straightened it out fairly well. This is kind of what the border warp does in Lightroom. So yeah, that's not bad considering that this place was not exactly flat anyway. So we could pull the set not the sky, but this part up a little bit to make it a little straighter. So, and then when you want to use any of these transform type tools, you have to go up here to click the check mark to make it stick. And then once that's done, and again that takes a little bit of time, I'm going to go ahead and flatten it again. I used TIFFs on the other side rather than TIFFs with layers, or DNGs with layers, just a little easier for me. Everybody does everything a little different, so it's going to be actually, yeah, it's going to be a TIFF over on the other side. So I'm going to save this. Save. Okay. It's a big image, so it's going to take a little bit to save it. Oh, and when I decreased the size of this thing so I had some moving room to work around in the window. So that's why it's so small right now. I just used the magnifying glass and then went to negative and made it smaller so that it wouldn't be quite so big. So now it's a TIFF. I'm going to go ahead and close this and close Photoshop. And here it is over here in Lightroom. So that's not too bad. Let's take a look at it converse to the one we did with Lightroom. So actually the one in Photoshop's a little better. So yeah, just have to use the warp tool in in transform over there, and you can actually straighten it out pretty well. So again, I would bring it over here to do my develop issues, you know, like cropping out the shadow and, you know, doing all the color corrections and adding some contrast and stuff like that. So that is pretty much how you do a panorama. We took it all the way from beginning to end. And you can also go ahead and review this recording if you have any questions, or if you want to go through it over and over again. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is Lynn Wizicki from the Illuminating Lens, and I'm doing this for Tampa Bay Camera Club.